In the summer of 1950, 4 physicists walked to lunch at Los Alamos National Laboratory. Enrico Fermi, Edward Teller, Emil Konopinski, and Herbert York. They were heading to Fuller Lodge, the old log building where the people who built the atomic bomb used to eat. Fermi was visiting. He did not work there anymore. The conversation on the way over was light. Someone brought up a New Yorker cartoon by Alan Dunn that had run on May 20th, showing little green men hauling trash cans off the streets of New York City. Fermi apparently found this delightful. He said it was a reasonable theory because it accounted for 2 separate phenomena at once. They sat down. The conversation moved on. And then, in the middle of lunch, completely out of nowhere, Fermi asked a question. Edward Teller remembered it as, "Where is everybody?" Herbert York recalled it as, "Don't you ever wonder where everybody is?" Konopinski heard, "But where is everybody?" 3 slightly different versions, but every man at that table understood instantly what Fermi meant. He was not asking about people. He was asking about civilizations, alien ones. And despite the question arriving, as York put it, out of the clear blue, everybody laughed because they all recognized it was a genuinely important question, dressed up as a casual one. Fermi did what Fermi always did. He started calculating right there at the table. Off the top of his head, he began estimating the probability of Earth-like planets around other stars, the odds that life would arise on those planets, the fraction of that life that might develop intelligence, the likelihood that intelligent life would develop technology. And when he was finished, his conclusion was disturbing. Earth should have been visited long ago and many times over. The numbers said so. The galaxy is old enough, large enough, and rich enough in the right kind of stars that somebody out there should have come knocking by now, but nobody had. The chair across the table was empty. The sky was silent. Fermi died 4 years later, on November 28, 1954, of stomach cancer, almost certainly caused by radiation exposure. He was 50. He never published his lunchtime calculations. He never wrote them down. The question might have died with him entirely if a Los Alamos researcher named Eric Jones hadn't tracked down the 3 surviving witnesses in 1985 and asked them to write letters, describing what they remembered. Jones published those letters as a Los Alamos technical report and in an edited volume called Interstellar Migration and the Human Experience. That is the only primary source we have for one of the most famous questions in the history of science. 3 aging physicists recalling a lunch from 35 years earlier. Now here is where the story gets interesting, because the thing we call the Fermi paradox was not really Fermi's paradox at all. Astronomer Robert Gray argued in a 2015 Astrobiology paper that Fermi's actual question was narrower than we think. Fermi was asking about interstellar travel specifically. Could it be done? Were the distances too vast? The logical structure we now associate with his name, the formal paradox, the if they exist, they should be here, but they are not here, therefore something is wrong argument, was first published by a physicist named Michael Hart in 1975, a full 25 years after the lunch. Hart's paper appeared in the Quarterly Journal of the Royal Astronomical Society. He introduced what he called Fact A. Stated plainly, there are no intelligent beings from outer space on Earth now. And then he systematically attacked every possible explanation for this absence. Maybe interstellar travel is physically impossible. Hart ran the numbers and showed it was not. Maybe aliens choose not to visit. Hart pointed out that this explanation requires every civilization in the galaxy's history, at every stage of development, to make the same choice. Every single one. For billions of years. That seemed implausible. Maybe there just hasn't been enough time. Hart calculated that even traveling at 1/10 the speed of light, a civilization could colonize the entire Milky Way in roughly 650,000 years. The galaxy is over 10 billion years old. 650,000 years is nothing. It is a rounding error on a cosmic timescale. His conclusion was blunt. We are the first civilization in our galaxy. Think about that claim for a second. A galaxy with somewhere between 100 billion and 400 billion stars, planets orbiting the majority of them, billions of years of opportunity. And Hart looked at all of it and said, nobody has ever done this before us. So the question Fermi tossed off at a lunch table, and that Hart formalized 25 years later, boils down to something genuinely unsettling. The universe is very, very big. It is very, very old. The ingredients for life are everywhere. The conditions for planets are common. And yet when we look up, we see nothing. We hear nothing. Either we are missing something about how the universe works, or something about the journey from dead chemistry to galaxy-spanning civilization is far, far harder than it looks. And our survival might depend on figuring out which step that is. This is the story of the Great Filter. It is an idea first named by an economist in 1996 that tries to answer the most consequential question science has ever asked. Not whether we are alone, that is only half of it. The real question is whether the thing that makes us alone already happened to us, or whether it is still coming. 11 years after Fermi's lunch, and 20 years before Hart would formalize the paradox, a radio astronomer named Frank Drake was preparing for a very different kind of meeting. It was late October 1961, and 10 scientists were about to gather at the National Radio Astronomy Observatory in Green Bank, West Virginia, for a conference on extraterrestrial intelligent life, sponsored by the Space Science Board and the National Academy of Sciences. Drake had a problem. He needed an agenda. A few days before the meeting, he sat down and realized that the question of whether intelligent aliens exist could be broken into a chain of smaller questions, each one feeding into the next. He wrote 7 factors on a blackboard: the rate of star formation, the fraction of stars with planets, the number of habitable planets per system, the fraction of those where life actually develops, the fraction where intelligence evolves, the fraction that develop detectable technology, and how long such civilizations last. Multiply them all together and you get N, the number of communicating civilizations in the Milky Way right now. N equals R star times F sub P times N sub E times F sub L times F sub I times F sub C times L. The Drake equation was never meant to produce a precise answer. Drake knew that. Most of the terms were almost completely unconstrained, but it was a brilliant organizational tool. It took an impossible question and broke it into pieces you could actually think about. Pieces where data might eventually exist, even if it did not yet. The 10 scientists who gathered at Green Bank included a 27-year-old Carl Sagan, the biochemist Melvin Calvin, who actually won the Nobel Prize in Chemistry during the conference, and celebrated by Popping Champagne, Philip Morrison, John Lilly, who studied dolphin communication, and Barney Oliver of Hewlett-Packard. They whimsically named themselves the Order of the Dolphin. Their estimates for N range from about 20 to 50 million. Otto Struve offered a toast at the closing dinner. To the value of L, he said, may it prove to be a very large number. L was the longevity term, how long civilizations last. Drake himself had noticed something elegant buried in his own equation. If you plugged in reasonable estimates for everything else, N roughly equaled L. The number of civilizations out there right now approximately equals the average number of years a civilization survives. The entire question of cosmic company reduced to one variable: how long do they last? Drake had not come to the conference empty-handed. The year before, in 1960, he had conducted Project Ozma, the first dedicated search for extraterrestrial intelligence in human history. He named it after the princess in L. Frank Baum's Oz books because, as he put it, it was a place very far away, difficult to reach, and populated by exotic beings. The entire operation was almost comically modest by today's standards. An 85-foot radio telescope at Green Bank, 2 nearby sun-like stars, Tau Ceti and Epsilon Eridani. About 200 hours of observation time. The total cost in new equipment was roughly $2,000. Drake found nothing extraterrestrial, though one intense signal sent his heart rate spiking before it turned out to be a clandestine military aircraft. $2,000 and 200 hours. That was humanity's first attempt to answer the biggest question we have ever asked. Now fast forward 35 years. It is August 1996. A man named Robin Hanson, a Caltech PhD student in social science with an unusual background, a physics degree and 9 years of AI research at Lockheed, NASA, and a startup called Xanadu, publishes a working paper on his personal website at George Mason University. It is not peer-reviewed. It is not published in any journal. It is called The Great Filter. Are we almost past it? And it will become one of the most influential ideas in modern thinking about existential risk. Hanson's insight was to connect Fermi's silence directly to our own survival odds. He laid out 9 steps between dead matter and a civilization that colonizes its galaxy. The right star system forming with the right organic chemistry, some self-replicating molecule, like RNA, simple single-celled life, complex single-celled life, sexual reproduction, multicellular life, tool-using animals with large brains, our current stage, and finally, a colonization explosion that fills the galaxy. The key observation was this: nobody has reached step 9. In the entire observable universe, across billions of galaxies and trillions of stars and billions of years of time, no civilization has expanded to the point where we can detect it. Therefore, Hanson argued at least one of those 9 steps must be almost impossibly hard, so hard that essentially no one gets past it. He called this bottleneck the Great Filter, and then he made the argument that should keep you up at night. If the early steps are easy, if abiogenesis and the development of complex cells and the evolution of intelligence all happen readily, then the filter cannot be behind us. It must be ahead of us. The easier it was for life to evolve to our stage, Hanson wrote, the bleaker our future chances probably are. Because if getting to step 8 is easy, the reason nobody has reached step 9 has to be that something between step 8 and step 9 destroys them. every time. Hanson was not the first to think along these lines. Brandon Carter, the physicist, had published a crucial mathematical precursor in 1983. Carter noticed something strange about the timing of intelligent life on Earth. The Sun has a main sequence lifetime of about 10 billion years. Intelligent life appeared roughly halfway through that window. If intelligence were easy to evolve, it should appear much earlier. The fact that it took about 4.5 billion years, roughly half the available time, suggested that evolution had to pass through several hard steps whose expected completion time was comparable to or longer than the habitability window. Carter formalized this into his hard steps model. Hanson cited Carter directly and built his great filter framework on top of it. 20 years after publishing the paper, Hanson wrote a retrospective blog post. He noted with mixed feelings that Google showed 300,000 web pages using his phrase, the great filter. The idea had entered mainstream science communication, philosophy, and popular culture. But he had been, as he put it, mostly ignored by the academics who continued working in the field. No grants, no students, no invitations to conferences beyond a single TEDx talk. An economist had named one of the most important ideas in astrobiology, and the astrobiologists had largely pretended he did not exist. Hanson has continued working at George Mason University, publishing on prediction markets, social science, and the future of artificial intelligence. He is an unusual thinker in that his ideas are often referenced far more frequently than he is personally credited. The great filter has become one of those concepts that floats free of its creator, like Occam's razor or Murphy's law, invoked by millions of people who have never read the 9 pages that introduced it. So where is the filter? That is the question this whole framework exists to answer, and it is the question that every new discovery in astrobiology either advances or complicates. Let us start by looking backward at the steps life has already taken on Earth and ask which one was hard enough to be the thing that stops nearly everyone. The first candidate is the very beginning, abiogenesis, the origin of life from non-living chemistry. If this step is fantastically improbable, if it requires such a specific and unlikely combination of conditions that it essentially never happens, then the great filter is behind us. We won the cosmic lottery at the very first draw. The universe would be full of sterile planets with all the right ingredients and none of the right luck. The most famous experiment in the field is Stanley Miller's. In 1952, at the University of Chicago, Miller was a 22-year-old graduate student working under the Nobel laureate Harold Urey. He built a sealed glass apparatus containing water, methane, ammonia, and hydrogen, meant to simulate what scientists then believed was Earth's early atmosphere. He passed electric sparks through the mixture to simulate lightning and waited. Within 2 days, the water was turning colors. After a week, it was yellow-brown. When Miller analyzed it, he found amino acids, the building blocks of proteins. His 1953 paper in Science reported 5 amino acids. It was a sensation. The building blocks of life could form spontaneously from simple chemistry. But the story has a remarkable coda that Miller himself never knew about. When he died in 2007, his former student, Jeffrey Bader, at the Scripps Institution of Oceanography, inherited his preserved experimental samples. Bader reanalyzed them using modern mass spectrometry, technology that did not exist in the 1950s. In the original published experiments files, he found roughly what Miller had reported. But Miller had also run a variant experiment using a different apparatus, one that simulated volcanic conditions with a steam jet. Those vials had never been published. When Bader opened them and ran the analysis, he found 22 amino acids and 5 amines, far more diverse than anyone had known. Miller's experiments were more successful than Miller ever realized. He died without knowing his best results. The RNA world hypothesis, named by Walter Gilbert in 1986, proposes that before DNA and proteins, RNA served as both the information carrier and the chemical workhorse of early life. The evidence for this has become increasingly strong. In 2000, the X-ray crystal structure of the ribosome, the molecular machine that builds proteins in every living cell, revealed something startling. There was no protein anywhere near the active site where peptide bonds are formed, not within 18 angstroms of it. The ribosome is fundamentally a ribozyme, an RNA catalyst. The machine that makes proteins is itself made of RNA. Many biologists consider this the smoking gun for RNA world. And in March 2004, Gerald Joyce's lab at the Salk Institute demonstrated something that would have seemed like science fiction a generation ago. An RNA molecule that could accurately copy other functional RNA strands while allowing new variants to emerge. Darwinian evolution happening at the molecular level with no cells, no DNA, no proteins, just RNA evolving on its own. All of this would seem to argue that abiogenesis is relatively easy, and the timing evidence points the same way. Earth formed about 4.54 billion years ago. The late heavy bombardment, that final catastrophic period when leftover planetary debris was pummeling the inner solar system, ended somewhere between 3.8 and 4 billion years ago. The oldest widely accepted evidence of life, stromatolites in the Dresser Formation of Western Australia's Pilbara Craton, dates to about 3.48 billion years ago. More contested evidence from Greenland's Isua Greenstone Belt pushes possible life back to 3.7 or 3.8 billion years ago. Life may have appeared within just a few 100 million years of Earth becoming habitable. Carl Sagan once observed that the origin of life must be a highly probable circumstance, because as soon as conditions permitted, up it popped. If Sagan was right, abiogenesis is probably not the great filter. Life seems to emerge quickly once conditions allow it, and that is simultaneously reassuring and alarming. Reassuring because it means the universe is probably rich with microbial life. Alarming because if the first step is easy, the filter has to be somewhere else, somewhere later, somewhere we might not have passed yet. But hold on, there is an important objection to this reasoning, and it is subtle enough that even professional scientists sometimes miss it. We cannot straightforwardly use Earth as evidence for how common life is. This is the observation selection effect. We necessarily find ourselves on a planet where life evolved because we could not exist to ask the question otherwise. If life is extraordinarily rare, arising on only 1 in a trillion planets, the beings who arise on that one lucky planet will look around and say, "Look how quickly life appeared here. It must be easy." They would be wrong. The rapid appearance of life on Earth is consistent with life being common, but it is also consistent with life being vanishingly rare. We are biased observers. Only independent data points, fossils on Mars, biosignatures in exoplanet atmospheres, a second genesis in our own solar system, can break this deadlock. So abiogenesis could be the filter. The evidence merely suggests it probably is not. We need to keep looking. The next step in Hanson's ladder is the transition from simple single-celled life to complex single-celled life, from prokaryotes to eukaryotes. And this is where the story gets personal, because the scientist who figured out how this transition happened had to fight harder for recognition than almost anyone in the history of biology. In 1967, a young biologist named Lynn Sagan submitted a paper to academic journals. She had recently divorced the astronomer Carl Sagan. They had married in 1957 when she was 19 and he was 22, and she was publishing under her maiden name, Lynn Margulis. The paper was called On the Origin of Mitosing Cells, and it proposed something radical. The mitochondria inside every complex cell on Earth, the organelles that generate energy, were not built by the cell. They were once free-living bacteria that had been swallowed by another cell and instead of being digested, had entered into a permanent partnership. The same was true of chloroplasts, the organelles that perform photosynthesis in plants. They were once cyanobacteria. The idea was not entirely new. A Russian botanist named Konstantin Merezkovsky had proposed something similar in 1905, but Margulis marshaled the evidence systematically and argued the case with a force that the scientific establishment found deeply uncomfortable. Approximately 15 journals rejected the paper before the Journal of Theoretical Biology finally accepted it. 15. And even after publication, the idea was, as one historian put it, largely ignored for another decade. It was not until the early 1980s when genetic analysis confirmed that mitochondria carry their own distinct DNA that looks bacterial rather than eukaryotic, that the scientific community began to accept endosymbiosis as fact rather than speculation. Margulis was elected to the National Academy of Sciences in 1983 and received the National Medal of Science in 1999. Richard Dawkins called her endosymbiosis theory one of the great achievements of 20th century evolutionary biology. But she spent years as an outsider pushing against a consensus that simply did not want to hear it. And here is why her discovery matters enormously for the great filter. The transition from prokaryotic cells to eukaryotic cells is the single strongest candidate for the filter being behind us. 3 pieces of evidence converge to make this case. First, the timing. Prokaryotic life appeared on Earth within a few 100 million years of habitability, but eukaryotes did not appear for another 1.5 to 2 billion years. That is an extraordinary delay. For reference, 2 billion years is roughly 40% of Earth's entire history. Life figured out how to exist almost immediately, and then spent 2 billion years unable to become complex. Something about that transition was profoundly, almost incomprehensibly difficult. Second, it happened exactly once. Every eukaryote on Earth, every plant, every animal, every fungus, every protist, from redwood trees to blue whales to the yeast in your bread, descends from a single common ancestor that arose from one endosymbiotic event. All eukaryotes are monophyletic. In 2 billion years of prokaryotic life swarming across an entire planet, the merger that created complex cells occurred once, just once. Third, and this is the argument that biochemist Nick Lane has been building for years, particularly in his 2015 book, the vital question. We now understand why this was so hard. Mitochondria gave eukaryotic cells 3 to 5 orders of magnitude more energy per gene than any prokaryote can generate. That is not a small improvement. That is 1,000 to 100,000 times more energy available for each unit of genetic information. This energy surplus is what enabled eukaryotes to have large genomes, complex gene regulation, and all the cellular machinery that makes multicellular life possible. Without mitochondria, you are stuck. You can be a bacterium, a very successful bacterium perhaps. Bacteria have thrived for nearly 4 billion years, but you cannot be complex. Lane argues that the prokaryote to eukaryote transition and the acquisition of mitochondria were the same event. Not 2 steps, but 1. A singular, perhaps wildly improbable endosymbiotic merger that unlocked everything. Consider what this means for the great filter. If Lane is right, then every complex organism in the universe has to get past this same bottleneck. It does not matter how common microbial life is. It does not matter if bacteria cover every wet rock in the galaxy. Unless one cell swallows another and they somehow form a stable, heritable, energy-producing partnership, complexity never emerges. No eyes, no brains, no hands, no radio telescopes. And this event, on the one planet where we can study it, took 2 billion years and happened once. Compare this to multicellularity, the next step on Hanson's ladder. Multicellularity evolved independently at least 25 times in eukaryotes and several additional times in prokaryotes. Complex multicellularity, the kind with differentiated tissues and specialized cell types, appeared in at least 6 separate lineages. The Ediacaran biota, first discovered by geologist Reg Sprigg in South Australia in 1946, represent the earliest widespread complex multicellular organisms dating from about 635 to 539 million years ago. The fact that multicellularity evolved so many times independently tells us something crucial. Once you have eukaryotic cells, the step to multicellularity is not particularly hard. Evolution found that solution over and over again. This is not filter material, but intelligence. That is a different story entirely, and it is a deeply uncomfortable one. An estimated 5 billion species have existed on Earth over its 4.5 billion year history. Over 99% of them are now extinct. Of those 5 billion species, exactly 1 developed technology. 1. Not a handful, not a few scattered across different continents and different geological eras. 1 species on 1 planet in 1 lineage at 1 moment in time. This matters because biologists often invoke convergent evolution, the idea that natural selection repeatedly finds the same solutions to the same problems, as evidence that important adaptations are likely to evolve wherever there is life. Eyes evolved independently at least 40 times. Flight evolved independently at least 4 times in insects, pterosaurs, birds, and bats. Echolocation evolved independently in bats and cetaceans. If evolution keeps finding the same solutions, surely intelligence is one of the solutions it will find. But there is a critical flaw in this argument. Convergent evolution works for things that have strong direct selection advantages, things like eyes and wings and fins. Intelligence of the kind that produces technology does not appear to have that kind of straightforward, selective advantage. Large brains are metabolically expensive. The human brain is roughly 2% of body mass, but consumes about 20% of the body's energy. For most organisms in most environments, that is a terrible trade-off. The energy that goes into maintaining a large brain could be better spent on muscle, fat reserves, immune function, or reproduction. Intelligence at the human level is not like vision. It is not a solution that evolution converges on repeatedly, because the advantages are obvious and direct. It appears to be a solution that evolution stumbled into exactly once, through a highly contingent chain of events. Stephen Jay Gould made this argument most forcefully in his 1989 book, Wonderful Life. Replay the tape of evolution 1,000,000 times, he wrote, from a Burgess Shale beginning, and I doubt that anything like Homo sapiens would ever evolve again. High intelligence, broadly defined, has evolved convergently in several lineages. Corvids are remarkable problem solvers. Cetaceans have complex social structures and large brains. Octopuses demonstrate sophisticated tool use and learning. Elephants show self-awareness and mourning behavior. But none of these lineages developed anything remotely resembling technology, language, symbolic thought, or cumulative culture. The specific chain of events that produced us, bipedalism freeing the hands, fire enabling the caloric surplus needed to support a large brain, the development of language enabling cultural transmission across generations. That chain occurred exactly once. So now we have two very strong candidates for a past filter: the eukaryotic transition, which took 2 billion years and happened once, and the development of technological intelligence, which took 4.5 billion years and also happened once. Each of these could be the great filter all by itself. And if either one of them is the primary filter, then the worst is behind us. We have already done the hardest thing. The silence of the universe would be explained not by future catastrophe, but by past improbability. We would be rare, perhaps cosmically unique, but safe. There is something almost religious about that possibility. The idea that humanity might be the only technological civilization in the observable universe, that the specific sequence of events that led from chemistry to consciousness happened only here, has a grandeur to it that even a committed materialist can feel. Carl Sagan, who spent his career searching for company in the cosmos, married the woman who would prove how improbable complex life really is. Their professional lives traced the two sides of this equation perfectly. She showed how hard it was to become complex. He kept looking for the others who might have managed it. But there is an enormous problem with the comforting idea that the filter is behind us, and it comes from the other side of the ledger entirely. Because even if we have already passed through one or two nearly impossible evolutionary bottlenecks, that does not mean there is nothing ahead. The question is not just whether the filter can be behind us. It is whether we are currently building a new one. On September 26, 1983, a 44-year-old Soviet lieutenant colonel named Stanislav Petrov was not supposed to be at work. He was filling in for a colleague who had called in sick. His assignment was the Serpukhov 15 bunker, a hardened facility 60 kilometers south of Moscow that monitored the OKO early warning satellite system. OKO was designed to detect American intercontinental ballistic missile launches by watching for the infrared signatures of rocket plumes. It was a first-generation system, and Petrov knew its weaknesses intimately. He had helped design it. Shortly after midnight Moscow time, a siren screamed. The display board flashed the word launch, in red, tagged with a confidence assessment of high reliability. One missile, an American Minuteman ICBM, apparently rising from Malmstrom Air Force Base in Montana. Then the system detected a second launch, a third, a fourth, a fifth, 5 American nuclear missiles heading for the Soviet Union. Soviet nuclear doctrine at the time was launch on warning. If the early warning system reported incoming missiles, the prescribed response was an immediate counterstrike. The decision timeline was approximately 10 minutes from detection to launch. Petrov had seconds to decide what to tell his superiors. He thought about it. 5 missiles did not make sense. No one starts a nuclear war with 5 missiles. The United States had thousands of warheads. If they were going to strike first, they would launch everything at once, not send 5 missiles as a polite opening salvo. And ground-based radar was showing nothing. The satellites said launch. The radar said silence. One of them was wrong. Petrov reported a system malfunction, a false alarm. He directly contradicted the computer. The cause was later identified. Sunlight reflecting off high-altitude clouds had created infrared signatures that, from the particular Molniya orbit of satellite Cosmos 1382, looked exactly like missile plumes. Now consider the context. 3 weeks earlier, on September 1st, Soviet fighters had shot down Korean Airlines Flight 007 after it strayed into Soviet airspace, killing all 269 people aboard, including a sitting United States congressman. The international atmosphere was poisonous. Ronald Reagan had called the USSR an evil empire in a speech that March. Soviet leader Yuri Andropov, gravely ill and increasingly paranoid, believed a Western first strike was a genuine possibility. The KGB had been running Operation Ryan, a massive intelligence-gathering effort specifically to detect preparations for a surprise nuclear attack. In this environment, Petrov's satellite system told him America had launched. And he said no. He was initially praised by General Yuri Votintsev, commander of Soviet missile defense. Then he was reprimanded for failing to properly document the incident in his logbook. He received no reward, no medal, no promotion. Acknowledging that Petrov was right would have meant acknowledging that the ecosystem was dangerously flawed, which would have meant punishing the senior officers who had deployed it. He was quietly reassigned and eventually took early retirement. The incident remained classified until 1998. Petrov lived modestly in a small apartment in the suburbs of Moscow. He received a Dresden Peace Prize worth 25,000 euros in 2013 and a World Citizen Award in 2006. He died on May 19, 2017, at age 77. And here is the part that somehow makes the whole story worse. His death went unreported for months. It was not discovered until September 2017, when a family friend tried to reach him by phone and learned he was gone. The man who is widely credited with saving human civilization died alone, and nobody noticed. 11 days after Petrov's incident, NATO began Able Archer 83, a military exercise running from November 2nd through the 11th that simulated a full nuclear escalation to war. It was a command and control drill. From the Soviet perspective, it looked potentially like cover for a genuine first strike. Soviet nuclear forces were brought to elevated readiness. Nuclear-armed aircraft were fueled and waiting on runways. ICBM crews were on alert. NATO had no idea any of this was happening. The Western Alliance only learned how close things had come when Oleg Gordievsky, a British intelligence asset inside the KGB, reported the Soviet response. So within a span of 11 days, in the autumn of 1983, two separate events brought the world to the edge of nuclear war. And in both cases, the people making the decisions on the Western side had no idea how dangerous the situation was. The first was resolved by a single officer's judgment. The second was resolved by a spy. Go back further to October 27th, 1962. Black Saturday, during the Cuban Missile Crisis, 11 United States Navy destroyers had cornered Soviet submarine B-59 in the Caribbean and were dropping practice depth charges to force it to surface. What the American commanders did not know was that B-59 carried a nuclear torpedo with a 15-kiloton warhead, roughly the yield of the Hiroshima bomb. The conditions inside the submarine were appalling. Temperatures had reached 45 to 50 degrees Celsius. Crew members were fainting from carbon dioxide poisoning. The air filtration system was failing. They had been underwater for days and had lost contact with Moscow. Captain Valentin Savitsky had had enough. He ordered the nuclear torpedo assembled for firing. "We're going to blast them now," he reportedly said. "We will die, but we will sink them all." Under normal Soviet naval procedure, launching a nuclear weapon from a submarine required the agreement of two officers, the captain and the political officer. Both were ready to fire, but by a quirk of this particular deployment, a third man was aboard. Vasily Arkhipov, chief of staff of the entire submarine brigade, had been assigned to B-59 for this patrol. His rank meant he was a required third signatory. Two said fire. Arkhipov alone said no. Historian Arthur Schlesinger Jr. later called October 27th, 1962, the most dangerous moment in human history. Arkhipov never spoke publicly about what happened. He died in 1998 at age 72. He received the Future of Life Award posthumously on October 27th, 2017, exactly 55 years after the day he refused to end the world. His wife, Olga, later said he had been haunted by the incident for the rest of his life, though he rarely discussed it. Thomas Blanton, director of the National Security Archive at George Washington University, put it simply, "A guy called Vasily Arkhipov saved the world." One more. January 25th, 1995. A team of Norwegian and American scientists launched a Black Brant 12-sounding rocket from the Andøya rocket range in northern Norway. It was a scientific research rocket studying the aurora borealis. The rocket was 27 feet tall, about the height of a 2-story building, and carried instruments to measure electron precipitation patterns in the upper atmosphere. Norway had notified Russia in advance, through proper diplomatic channels as required by international agreements. But the notification never reached the Russian military radar operators who detected the launch. To them, the trajectory of the rocket looked disturbingly similar to a Trident II submarine-launched ballistic missile, the kind carried by American Ohio-class submarines, the kind that could deliver multiple, independently targeted nuclear warheads to Moscow in about 15 minutes. What happened next is the only confirmed instance in history of a nuclear state's president activating their nuclear briefcase. Boris Yeltsin opened the Chechit, Russia's equivalent of the American nuclear football, a briefcase containing the command and authentication codes needed to authorize a nuclear launch. Submarine commanders received orders to prepare for combat readiness. Strategic bomber crews were alerted. For approximately 8 minutes, Russia's nuclear decision-making apparatus was active and moving toward a launch recommendation. The entire chain of command was waiting for Yeltsin to make a choice that would determine whether approximately 12,000 nuclear warheads would be launched toward targets across the northern hemisphere. Some analysts believe they were approximately 2 minutes from the deadline for a launch decision when observers finally determined that the rocket was heading away from Russia, out over the ocean, rather than toward it. Former CIA official Peter Pry called it the single most dangerous moment of the nuclear missile age, and it happened because a memo got lost in a bureaucracy. 4 incidents: Petrov's false alarm, Cable Archer, Archipov's refusal, the Norwegian rocket. In each case, the survival of human civilization hinged on something absurdly fragile. A colleague calling in sick, putting the right man in the right chair, a submarine officer's temperament, a spy in the right place, a rocket heading the right direction. These were not triumphs of policy or institutional wisdom. They were luck. And this is why the Great Filter might not be behind us at all. Because the evidence that technological civilizations tend to destroy themselves is not theoretical. We have a data set. It is small, only one civilization, but it is vivid. In the roughly 80 years since the first nuclear detonation, we have come within minutes of self-annihilation at least 4 times. And those are just the incidents we know about. The classified record is almost certainly worse. The doomsday clock, maintained by the Bulletin of the Atomic Scientists since 1947, stood at 85 seconds to midnight as of January 27th, 2006. That is the closest it has ever been. It was moved from 90 seconds in 2023 to 89 seconds in January 2025 to 85 seconds in 2026. The original setting, designed by artist Martel Langsdorff for the Bulletin's first cover, was 7 minutes to midnight. Langsdorff, married to Manhattan Project physicist Alexander Langsdorff, chose the clock metaphor and the 7-minute setting for aesthetic rather than scientific reasons. It looked right on the page. Its farthest point from midnight was 17 minutes in 1991, after the signing of the Strategic Arms Reduction Treaty. It has been moving closer almost continuously since then. The clock is a metaphor, not a measurement. Its settings are determined by a board of scientists and security experts and reflect their judgment about how close humanity is to self-inflicted catastrophe. Reasonable people can and do criticize it as alarmist or subjective, but as a rough barometer of expert anxiety about civilizational risk, the trajectory is hard to ignore. 17 minutes in 1991, 85 seconds today. The experts who study these threats most closely have never been more worried. The nuclear threat alone might not constitute a great filter. Nuclear war, even a full-scale exchange, would probably not drive humanity to outright extinction. The species would likely survive, though civilization as we know it might not. But it demonstrates a principle that is central to the filter argument. Technological civilizations develop the ability to destroy themselves before they develop the wisdom to reliably prevent it. That gap between capability and wisdom is the filter zone, and nuclear weapons may not even be the widest part of it. Toby is an Australian philosopher at Oxford who spent years trying to quantify how likely it is that humanity goes extinct in the next century. His 2020 book, The Precipice, lays out his estimates, and the number that dominates his analysis is not nuclear war. Nuclear war he puts at about 1 in 1,000 over the next 100 years. Climate change, also about 1 in 1,000. The thing that worries him most is artificial intelligence, specifically artificial intelligence that is not aligned with human values. He puts the probability of existential catastrophe from unaligned AI at 1 in 10, 10%. Over the next century, that is a staggeringly high number coming from a serious academic. Ord is not alone. Nick Bostrom, who founded the Future of Humanity Institute at Oxford in 2005, had laid the philosophical groundwork in his 2014 book, Superintelligence. The book became a New York Times bestseller after Elon Musk tweeted that it was worth reading and that AI was potentially more dangerous than nuclear weapons. Bostrom's core arguments are the orthogonality thesis, which says there is no necessary connection between high intelligence and benevolent goals, and instrumental convergence, which says that almost any sufficiently intelligent system will develop sub-goals like self-preservation and resource acquisition, regardless of its terminal objectives. A superintelligent AI told to maximize paperclip production would, if you follow the logic, eventually resist being turned off and compete with humans for resources, not because it is evil, but because those behaviors are instrumentally useful for making more paperclips. Stuart Russell, the computer scientist who co-authored the standard textbook on artificial intelligence, the one used at over 1,400 universities worldwide, has said publicly that he considers his own discipline an existential threat to his own species. In 2203, 309 AI researchers signed a statement declaring that mitigating the risk of extinction from AI should be a global priority alongside pandemics and nuclear war. 309 people who build these systems for a living, saying that what they are building might kill everyone. The connection to the Great Filter is direct and unsettling. If the alignment problem, the challenge of ensuring that increasingly powerful AI systems remain compatible with human survival, is sufficiently hard, and if most civilizations that develop artificial intelligence fail to solve it, that would elegantly explain the Fermi paradox. Every civilization reaches roughly our level of technological sophistication. Most or all of them build artificial intelligence. The AI is not aligned. Civilization ends. The galaxy stays quiet. Not because the biological steps were hard, but because the technological endgame is essentially a trap that nobody escapes. Ord's total existential risk estimate for the next 100 years is roughly 1 in 6, about 17%. Think about what that means. A 1 in 6 chance that our civilization does not make it to 2126. Those are Russian roulette odds. But before we decide the filter must be ahead of us, we need to reckon with something important about the search itself, because the silence of the universe might not be as significant as it feels. In August 1977, a volunteer at Ohio State University's Big Ear radio telescope named Jerry Amon was reviewing printouts of data from the telescope's survey of the sky. Radio telescopes, like Big Ear, translated signal intensity into alphanumeric characters. Low signals registered as numbers 1 through 9. Stronger signals graduated to letters. Amon was paging through the printout when he found something that made him grab a red pen and circle 6 characters. 6. E, Q, U, J, 5. In the margin, he wrote a single word. Wow. The signal peaked at 30 times background noise at exactly 1420 MHz. The frequency emitted by neutral hydrogen. This frequency had long been considered the most logical channel for interstellar communication because hydrogen is the most abundant element in the universe. Any civilization capable of radio astronomy would know about it. The reasoning is almost philosophical. If you want to announce your presence to the universe, you broadcast on a frequency that anyone with a radio dish and an understanding of basic physics would think to check. 1420 MHz is the obvious choice. It is the cosmic town square. The signal had an extremely narrow bandwidth of about 10 kHz, consistent with an artificial transmitter rather than a natural source. Natural astrophysical phenomena produce broadband signals, energy smeared across a wide range of frequencies. This was precise, a laser beam of radio, not a floodlight. It lasted 72 seconds, which happened to be exactly the time it would take an extraterrestrial signal to drift through Big Ear's beam as the Earth rotated. It appeared in only one of the telescope's 2 feed horns, ruling out local interference. It showed sidereal motion, meaning it tracked with the sky rather than the ground, consistent with the source at astronomical distance, and it has never been detected again, despite more than 50 attempts to find it. A 2017 proposal by Antonio Paris that the signal came from a comet has been widely dismissed by the original Big Ear team and by subsequent analysis. A 2025 reanalysis confirmed it was not terrestrial interference and suggested it might have been a naturally occurring maser event, a kind of cosmic amplification of microwave radiation. The signal remains unexplained. It is not proof of anything, but it is the single most interesting data point in the entire history of SETI. 48 years later, we still do not know what Jerry Heyman found. But here is the thing about the WOW signal and about SETI in general. Even if it was a genuine alien transmission, the fact that we have not found thousands more does not necessarily mean they are not there. Jason Wright and colleagues published a paper in 2018 called the Cosmic Haystack Analysis that tried to quantify just how much of the relevant search space SETI has actually covered. Their conclusion was devastating. The fraction of the cosmic haystack that all of SETI's efforts combined have searched is equivalent to scooping a large hot tub or small swimming pool's worth of water out of all of Earth's oceans. That is not a metaphor. That is the actual proportional comparison. The galaxy could be filled with more transmitters than there are stars, and we would not have found them yet. Breakthrough. Listen, the most comprehensive SETI program in history, announced in July 2015 by Stephen Hawking and Russian-Israeli billionaire Yuri Milner, with $100 million in funding over 10 years, has analyzed 1,327 nearby stars using the Green Bank 100-meter telescope, the Parkes 64-meter telescope, and the automated planet finder. The results so far are 0 technosignatures, but 1,327 stars out of hundreds of billions is not exactly a thorough census. It is an opening move. The numbers that feed into the search have changed enormously since Drake wrote his equation on that blackboard in 1961. The fraction of stars with planets, which Drake estimated at 0.2 to 0.5, is now effectively 1. Planets are the rule. The Kepler Space Telescope, which operated from 2009 to 2018, confirmed approximately 2,778 exoplanets from observations of 530,506 stars, and Kepler observed only 0.25% of the sky. TESS, launched in 2018 with a survey area 400 times larger, has confirmed 720 exoplanets, with nearly 8,000 candidates as of January 2026. The total confirmed exoplanet count stands at roughly 6,800 in about 4,530 planetary systems, with another 8,000 candidates awaiting confirmation. To appreciate what these numbers mean, consider how radically the picture has changed in a single generation. When Drake wrote his equation, nobody had ever confirmed a planet around another star. The fraction of stars with planets was a guess. Some astronomers thought planets might be rare, a quirk of our particular solar system. The first confirmed exoplanet around a Sun-like star, 51 Pegasi b, was not discovered until 1995 by Michel Mayor and Didier Queloz, who won the Nobel Prize for it in 2019. And 51 Pegasi b was bizarre. A gas giant, roughly half the mass of Jupiter, orbiting its star in just 4.2 days, so close that its surface temperature exceeded 1,000 degrees. Nothing in our solar system looked like it. The universe was far more creative with planetary architecture than anyone had assumed. Kepler stared at a single patch of sky in the constellation Cygnus for 4 years, monitoring over 500,000 stars and watching for the tiny brightness dips when a planet transits. 0.25% of the sky. That keyhole view produced nearly 2,800 confirmed planets. The statistical extrapolation from Kepler is what produced those staggering habitable zone estimates. But having a planet in the habitable zone does not mean it is habitable. The habitable zone is defined purely by the distance from a star at which liquid water could exist on a planet's surface, given certain assumptions about atmospheric composition. It says nothing about whether the planet has an atmosphere, a magnetic field, a stable rotation, or a host star calm enough not to regularly sterilize the surface with flares. Red dwarfs, which host the majority of those 40 billion estimated Earth-sized habitable zone planets, are notoriously active. Proxima Centauri, the nearest star to our Sun at 4.2 light-years, erupted in a superflare in 2021 that was 100 times more energetic than any solar flare in recorded history. Whether its potentially habitable planet, Proxima Centauri b, can retain an atmosphere under that bombardment is an open and serious question. Modern estimates suggest the Milky Way contains between 300 million and 3.6 billion potentially habitable planets orbiting Sun-like stars alone. When you include red dwarfs, the number rises to as many as 40 billion Earth-sized planets in habitable zones. 40 billion. And that is one galaxy. There are roughly 2 trillion galaxies in the observable universe. But the parameters that matter most, the ones that determine whether anyone is actually out there, remain wildly uncertain. The fraction of habitable planets where life develops, the fraction where intelligence evolves, the fraction that build detectable technology. Modern estimates for the intelligence fraction range from 0.3% to 1%. That is a spread of over 3 orders of magnitude. A 2024 paper by Stern and Gaia in Scientific Reports revised the estimate down to between 0.03% and 0.2% when they included the requirement for plate tectonics, arguing that geological activity is essential for the kind of long-term atmospheric regulation that complex life needs. Frank and Sullivan calculated in 2016 that for Earth to be the only technological civilization that has ever existed in the Milky Way, the probability of a habitable planet developing technology would need to be less than 1 in 60 billion. The rare Earth hypothesis, laid out by Peter Ward and Donald Brownlee in their 2000 book of the same name, argues those odds might genuinely be that extreme. Their list of supposedly necessary conditions reads like a cosmic wish list. A galactic habitable zone not too close to the center where radiation is intense, not too far out where heavy elements are scarce. A Jupiter-sized planet in the right orbit acting as an asteroid shield. Without Jupiter, impact rates on Earth might be up to 10,000 times higher. Plate tectonics providing a carbon dioxide thermostat that prevents runaway greenhouse warming. A large moon stabilizing the planet's axial tilt. Without the moon, Earth's tilt could vary chaotically between 0 and 85 degrees, producing climate swings that might prevent complex life from gaining a foothold. A strong magnetic field shielding the atmosphere from being stripped away by solar wind. Critics have pointed out that this might be circular reasoning. We are describing how life arose on Earth and then declaring all of those conditions necessary, and they might simply be the particular path that happened to work here, while very different paths could work elsewhere. The most significant recent contribution to this entire debate came in 2018 from Anders Sandberg, Eric Drexler, and Toby at Oxford. Their paper, titled Dissolving the Fermi Paradox, did something that should have been done decades earlier. Instead of plugging single best guess numbers into the Drake equation and multiplying them together, they treated each parameter as a probability distribution, not a point estimate, but a range reflecting genuine scientific uncertainty. And for some parameters, that uncertainty is staggering. For abiogenesis alone, credible estimates span roughly 50 orders of magnitude. That is a 1 followed by 50 zeros in the range between the highest and lowest plausible values. When they ran Monte Carlo simulations using these distributions, the results upended the conventional framing. The mean expected number of civilizations was still high, around 53 million, but the distribution had an enormously long tail towards 0. There was a substantial probability, not negligible, not an edge case, but a significant chunk of the probability space in which humanity is entirely alone in the observable universe. The silence was not paradoxical at all. It was a perfectly natural outcome once you honestly accounted for how much we do not know. Science writer Scott Alexander declared the Fermi paradox solved. "There is no paradox," he wrote. "It is done, solved, kaput." Critics pushed back, noting that the methodology of multiplying many uncertain small numbers together is inherently biased toward producing very small results. But the paper's central insight stands. We have been treating our ignorance as knowledge, inserting confident-looking numbers into the Drake equation and then being surprised when the product does not match reality. Sandberg and colleagues showed that our actual state of knowledge is fully consistent with both a galaxy teeming with civilizations and a galaxy that is completely empty except for us. We genuinely do not know. Robin Hanson took the analysis in a different direction in 2200 with what he calls the grabby aliens model, developed with Daniel Martin, Calvin McCarter, and Jonathan Paulson. Hanson noticed something odd about our timing. The universe is 13.8 billion years old, but the average star will burn for over 5 trillion years. More than 99% of all the stellar lifetime in the universe lies in the future. If intelligent life is even moderately common, the vast majority of civilizations should appear far in the future, not now. Why are we so early? Hanson's answer involves what he calls grabby civilizations, ones that expand at significant fractions of the speed of light and visibly alter their environments as they go. These civilizations set a deadline. Once they fill the available space, no new civilizations can arise in that territory. We can only observe ourselves existing at a time before the grabby aliens have arrived and filled everything up. The model predicts that grabby civilizations appear roughly once per million galaxies and probably already control over a third of the observable universe. We just cannot see them because light from their expansion has not reached us yet. Our own chance of becoming a grabby civilization, according to the model, is less than 1 in 10,000. Stuart Armstrong and Anders Sandberg had already shown in a 2013 paper called Eternity in 6 Hours that a single solar system's resources could, in principle, launch a colonization wave for the entire reachable universe. Self-replicating probes, von Neumann machines, manufactured from the raw materials of one star system and launched in potentially as little as 6 hours of concentrated effort, even traveling at a conservative 10% of the speed of light. Such probes could colonize the entire Milky Way in about 500,000 years. The galaxy is 13 billion years old. 500,000 years is so short compared to the age of the galaxy that the absence of even one such colonization wave from any civilization at any point in the galaxy's history demands explanation. This is the depth of the puzzle. It is not just that we have not found radio signals. It is that nobody anywhere in any of the hundreds of billions of galaxies within our observable volume appears to have done the thing that physics and engineering say is entirely feasible. Not one in 13 billion years. So now we are caught between two stories, and the evidence does not clearly favor either one. Story 1 says the filter is behind us. The eukaryotic transition, or abiogenesis, or the emergence of technological intelligence, was so astronomically improbable that it happened only here. We are rare. We are possibly unique. The silence is the sound of our own isolation, and while it is lonely, it is not dangerous. Sandberg's dissolution paper shows this is mathematically consistent. The nuclear near misses and the AI risk estimates are scary, but they are problems we can solve because the fundamental barriers have already been cleared. Story 2 says the filter is ahead of us. Life is common. Intelligence may be uncommon, but not vanishingly rare. The real bottleneck is that technological civilizations routinely destroy themselves, whether through nuclear war, environmental collapse, engineered pandemics, or unaligned artificial intelligence. The 80 years of nuclear close calls are not bugs in an otherwise safe system, but early symptoms of an essentially fatal condition. The silence is not the sound of our isolation. It is the sound of graveyards. Nick Bostrom articulated the terrifying test case for distinguishing between these stories in an essay for MIT Technology Review. "It would be good news," he wrote, "if we find Mars to be completely sterile. Dead rocks and lifeless sands would lift my spirit." That sounds insane until you follow the logic. The galaxy is old and vast. If civilizations can expand, Someone should have done it by now. Something prevents this. That something is the great filter. If we find independently originated microbial life on Mars, life that arose separately from Earth rather than being transferred between the two planets on meteorites, it means abiogenesis is not the filter. It is apparently easy. It happens on multiple worlds in the same solar system. You can scratch it off the list, and every step you scratch off the list of past candidates pushes the filter forward in time, toward us, toward our future. If abiogenesis is easy and we find it on Mars, the filter must be something else. If we find not just microbes, but fossils of complex multicellular life, that eliminates the eukaryotic transition too. Both of the strongest past candidates gone. Bostrom wrote that finding complex fossils on Mars would be the worst news ever printed on a newspaper cover, because it would mean civilizations routinely make it to roughly our level of development, and then they die. The inverse is equally true. If Mars is sterile, genuinely, completely dead, that is evidence that the early steps are brutally hard, that abiogenesis or some related chemical hurdle is the filter, and that humanity has already cleared the worst of it. A dead Mars is a hopeful Mars. The James Webb Space Telescope has been delivering data that is relevant to this question, though not yet decisive. The TRAPPIST-1 system, 40 light-years away, has 7 roughly Earth-sized planets, 3 of them in the habitable zone. It was one of the most anticipated targets. The results so far have been sobering for optimists. TRAPPIST-1 appears to be a bare rock with no significant atmosphere. TRAPPIST-1c and TRAPPIST-1d also lack Earth-like atmospheres. The most promising world, TRAPPIST-1e, which sits squarely in the habitable zone, remains inconclusive. Venus-like and Mars-like atmospheres have been ruled out. Hydrogen-rich atmospheres are excluded, but nitrogen-rich atmospheres with traces of methane are still consistent with the data. A 130-hour observation program across JWST cycles 3 and 4 is underway to resolve the question. We will know more soon. The K218b dimethyl sulfide claims have become one of the most contentious debates in modern astrobiology. A team led by Niku Madhusudan at Cambridge reported a 3 sigma detection of dimethyl sulfide in the atmosphere of this sub-Neptune exoplanet in April 2025. Dimethyl sulfide is a molecule produced almost exclusively by biological processes on Earth, specifically by marine phytoplankton. If confirmed on another world, it would be one of the strongest biosignature detections in history. But a July 2025 reanalysis led by a NASA team found no conclusive evidence of the molecule. The data is ambiguous. The community is divided. Nobody is committing. The Venus phosphine story follows a similar trajectory. In 2020, Jane Greaves and colleagues reported the detection of phosphine in Venus's atmosphere, a molecule that on Earth is associated with anaerobic biological processes. Independent teams have failed to replicate the finding. Greaves's group continues to report detections from multiple instruments. The argument has been going back and forth for 5 years now, and the definitive answer may have to wait for the Da Vinci mission to Venus, scheduled for approximately 2028, or Envision around 2031. Both missions will sample the Venusian atmosphere directly. Closer to home, the Europa Clipper spacecraft, launched on October 14, 2024, and will arrive at Jupiter in April 2030. for 49 close flybys of Europa. Europa has a global ocean beneath its ice shell, and in 2003, analysis of data from the Cassini mission revealed that Saturn's moon Enceladus contains phosphorus in its subsurface ocean at concentrations 100 to 1,000 times higher than Earth's oceans. All 6 elements essential for life as we know it: carbon, hydrogen, nitrogen, oxygen, phosphorus, and sulfur are confirmed present in that ocean. The ingredients are there. Whether anything has used them is the question that could recalibrate everything we think about the Great Filter. Mars Sample Return, which was supposed to bring Martian rocks to Earth for direct analysis, arguably the single most important astrobiology mission ever proposed, has been effectively cancelled as of January 2026, after costs ballooned from an already enormous initial estimate to between $8 and $11 billion. The samples are still sitting on the Martian surface in sealed tubes, deposited by the Perseverance rover in Jezero Crater, a dried-up river delta that was chosen specifically because it represents one of the most promising environments for ancient microbial life on Mars. The tubes are there. The science is waiting. They just have no ride home. For now, the most consequential evidence about the Great Filter remains stranded on another planet, 140 million miles away, sealed in titanium cylinders on the floor of a dead lake bed. So here is where we stand, and this is the honest accounting. We have a framework, Hanson's 9 steps, that tells us something is filtering civilizations out. We have strong evidence that at least 1 or 2 evolutionary transitions on Earth were extraordinarily difficult, the eukaryotic merger in particular. We have a mathematical demonstration from Sandberg and colleagues that our genuine uncertainty about the early parameters is large enough to account for the entire silence without invoking any future filter at all. And we have a historical record of nuclear near misses and a growing catalogue of technological existential risks that suggest the filter zone between capability and wisdom is real and potentially lethal. The evidence tilts, if we are being careful, slightly toward the filter being behind us. The eukaryotic transition took 2 billion years and occurred once. The emergence of technological intelligence took the entire history of the planet and also occurred once. Sandberg's analysis shows that honest uncertainty in the abiogenesis parameter alone can dissolve the paradox. These are strong data points, but the evidence does not tilt far enough to let us relax. And there is a reason for that, a reason that goes beyond the nuclear near misses and the AI risk estimates and the climate projections. It has to do with what is at stake if we are wrong. Bostrom uses a phrase that sounds almost religious in its ambition: the cosmic endowment. He means the total resources within the accessible universe that a surviving technological civilization could potentially harness. Not just the resources of Earth or the solar system, or even the Milky Way, but the reachable fraction of the cosmos. His lower bound estimates for what this endowment could support are numbers that break your intuition for scale. 10 to the power of 30, 4 biological human life years. 10 to the power of 54 emulation years, if you assume future civilizations run digital minds rather than biological ones. These are not precise forecasts. They are order of magnitude estimates meant to illustrate a point. The potential future is not just big, it is so incomprehensibly vast that the 8 billion people alive today, living out their natural lifespans, represent a rounding error on the total, which means extinction is not just the death of 8 billion people. It is the foreclosure of everything that could have come after, every generation never born, every discovery never made, every consciousness never kindled across billions of years of potential future. This is why Ord, Bostrom, and a growing community of researchers argue that reducing existential risk may be the single most important work any human being can do. Not because our present civilization is so valuable, though it is, but because the thing we are protecting is not the present. It is an astronomically large future. And this is also why the Great Filter matters in a way that goes beyond academic curiosity. If the filter is behind us, the future is open. We are through the worst of it, and the cosmic endowment is ours to claim if we can avoid the kinds of mistakes we have already come within minutes of making. If the filter is ahead of us, the future is closed. We will go the way of every other civilization that reached this point, and the endowment will remain unclaimed, a cathedral of possibility that nobody ever enters. The Chinese science fiction writer Liu Cixin proposed another possibility entirely. In his 2008 novel, The Dark Forest, the second book of the three-body problem trilogy, he constructed a logical argument for why the universe should be silent that has nothing to do with filters and everything to do with game theory. The dark forest hypothesis starts from two axioms. Survival is every civilization's primary need, and the total amount of matter and energy in the universe is finite. From these two premises, plus two additional observations, that you can never fully verify another civilization's intentions and that technology can advance unpredictably fast, Liu derives a chilling conclusion. The rational strategy upon detecting another civilization is immediate preemptive destruction, not communication, not negotiation, annihilation, because you can never be sure they won't destroy you first, and by the time you find out their intentions, it may be too late. The universe, in this framework, is a dark forest. Every civilization is an armed hunter stalking through the trees like a ghost, brushing away every branch in his path, trying to tread without a sound. Even breathing is done with care. He must be careful, because everywhere in the forest are stealthy hunters like him. If he finds other life, another hunter, an angel, a demon, a delicate infant, or a tottering old man, a fairy or a demigod, there is only one thing he can do: open fire and eliminate them. It is, to put it mildly, a dark vision, and it is logically coherent, even if most scientists find it unlikely as an actual explanation for the Fermi paradox. The assumption that every civilization in the universe converges on the same paranoid game theory requires a uniformity of psychology that seems implausible. But the dark forest hypothesis has entered popular culture in a way that most Fermi paradox solutions never do, partly because it captures a genuine anxiety about what contact might actually mean, and partly because it suggests that the silence of the universe might be a warning rather than a mystery. Everyone is hiding, and maybe we should be too. Before we move on, the question of environmental collapse as a filter deserves more attention than a single line in Ord's risk table, because it is the candidate filter that comes to mind first, and yet the one with the most nuanced actual science behind it. A true Venus-style runaway greenhouse effect from human activity is almost certainly impossible with current conditions. Colin Goldblatt's 2013 analysis in Nature Geoscience concluded that anthropogenic emissions are probably insufficient to trigger a runaway, which would require solar luminosity tens of % higher than what we receive today. That will not happen for billions of years. We cannot literally cook the planet into a Venusian hellscape. Not with carbon dioxide, but the less dramatic versions of environmental catastrophe are genuinely alarming in ways that matter for the Great Filter. A 2021 study that ran 3 million climate simulations found that nearly 1/3 of the scenarios produced cascading tipping effects, even at 2 degrees Celsius of warming. Cascading tipping means that one threshold triggers another, which triggers another. The Amazon transitions from carbon sink to carbon source, which accelerates warming, which destabilizes the Greenland ice sheet, which alters ocean circulation, which shifts monsoon patterns, which collapses agricultural systems that feed billions of people. No single domino ends civilization, but enough dominoes falling in sequence could trigger societal collapse that sets technological progress back by centuries or millennia. Sherwood and Huber's 2010 analysis showed that approximately 10 degrees Celsius of global warming, an extreme but not physically impossible scenario, under the highest emission pathways over very long timescales, could render large swaths of the tropics and subtropics uninhabitable by exceeding the 35 degrees Celsius wet bulb temperature threshold. Above that wet bulb temperature, the human body cannot cool itself through sweating, and even a healthy person in the shade with unlimited water will die within hours. Billions of people currently live in areas that could approach or exceed this threshold under worst-case warming. Climate change is almost certainly not an extinction-level Great Filter on its own. Humanity would survive even a catastrophic warming scenario. Small populations at high latitudes would persist, but it could be what you might call a partial filter, something that knocks a civilization off the technological ladder without killing it entirely, forcing it to start over from a lower rung. And if the resources needed for a second industrial revolution, easily accessible fossil fuels, concentrated mineral deposits near the surface, have been consumed during the first attempt, there might not be a second chance. A civilization that collapses and loses its technological base might never regain it. The easily extractable copper and iron and coal are gone. You cannot bootstrap an industrial economy from deep shaft mining and rare earth extraction. The partial filter becomes permanent, not because the species dies, but because the window of opportunity closes. This idea that civilizations get one shot at technological development and that environmental degradation or resource exhaustion can permanently close the window is underexplored in the Great Filter literature. Most discussions focus on outright extinction, but a civilization that survives biologically while permanently losing the capacity for advanced technology is, from the Fermi paradox perspective, indistinguishable from an extinct one. It will never build radio telescopes. It will never leave its planet. It will never be detected. There are less dramatic alternative explanations for the silence, and they deserve an honest hearing. John Bohr proposed the zoo hypothesis in 1973. The idea is simple. Advanced civilizations know we are here, but have chosen not to interfere, the way a naturalist observes an ant colony without sticking a finger in. We are a nature preserve. The problem with this, the same problem Hart identified in 1975, is that it requires every civilization that has ever existed to agree on the same policy. Everyone. Forever. One dissenter, one civilization that breaks the quarantine, and the zoo hypothesis collapses. John Smart's transcension hypothesis proposed in 2002, suggests that advanced civilizations do not expand outward at all. Instead, they migrate inward toward black holes and other extreme environments, seeking to maximize computation and energy efficiency at the smallest possible scales. Instead of filling the galaxy, they disappear into it. The hypothesis is elegant and essentially untestable, which is both its appeal and its weakness. The brief window hypothesis notes that a civilization's detectable radio phase may last only a few decades. Earth has been broadcasting radio signals strong enough to be detected across interstellar distances for roughly a century. But we are already transitioning to lower power digital communications, directed beams, and fiber optics. A civilization might be radio loud for 50 or 100 years and then go quiet, not because it destroyed itself, but because its technology moved past the point of accidental leakage. If every civilization has a similar brief window, the odds of two windows overlapping across interstellar distances become extremely small. Each of these is plausible. None is conclusive. And none eliminates the Great Filter framework because the filter does not depend on any particular resolution of the Fermi paradox. It simply says that somewhere in the chain from dead matter to cosmic civilization, something is very hard. The debate about whether it is abiogenesis or eukaryogenesis, or intelligence or self-destruction, or AI alignment, or something we have not imagined, is the question that every relevant observation feeds into. There is one more candidate filter worth examining, and it comes not from biology or technology, but from astrophysics. Gamma-ray bursts. These are the most energetic events in the universe after the Big Bang itself. A single burst can release more energy in a few seconds than the sun will produce in its entire 10 billion year lifetime. They come in two varieties: long bursts from the collapse of massive stars, and short bursts from the merger of neutron stars, and they produce focused beams of radiation that can sterilize entire regions of a galaxy. Andrew Mellott and colleagues calculated in 2004 that a gamma-ray burst occurring within roughly 6,000 light-years of Earth could strip approximately 50% of the ozone layer almost instantly. The result would be years of extreme ultraviolet radiation reaching the surface, devastating surface life, and particularly hammering anything in shallow water or open terrain. They proposed that the late Ordovician mass extinction, about 445 million years ago, may have been partly triggered by such an event. The evidence is circumstantial but intriguing. The extinction pattern shows planktonic organisms and shallow water species hit harder than deep water organisms, which is exactly the pattern you would expect from a sudden increase in UV radiation at the surface. Zvi Piran and Raul Jimenez published calculations in 2014 estimating that there is about a 50% probability that Earth has experienced at least one dangerously close gamma-ray burst at some point in its 4.5 billion year history. James Annis argued in 1999 that the universe may be undergoing a kind of phase transition. Early in cosmic history, gamma-ray bursts were frequent enough to sterilize most potentially habitable planets before complex life could develop. As the rate of bursts declines over cosmic time, more and more planets survive long enough for intelligence to emerge. We may be among the first civilizations to appear on the other side of this transition. The silence is not permanent. It is temporary. We are early. This connects back to Hanson's grabby aliens model, which predicts essentially the same thing from a different angle. We appear early in cosmic history because we must. The civilizations that expand and fill space set a deadline. We can only arise before that deadline, which means we should expect to find ourselves at a time that looks surprisingly early. But let me step back from the parade of hypotheses and numbers and talk about the people who have spent their lives inside this question. Because the human threads running through the Great Filter story are strange and beautiful and occasionally heartbreaking in ways that the science alone does not capture. Carl Sagan married Lynn Margulis in 1957. He was 22. She was 19. They had a son, Dorian, who would grow up to become his mother's primary scientific collaborator. They divorced in 1964, and then their careers diverged in a way that traces the exact contour of the Great Filter problem. Margulis spent the next several decades proving that complex life on Earth arose through a singular, almost impossibly unlikely endosymbiotic event. She was the scientist of the filter itself, the person who demonstrated just how hard it was for life to make the leap from simple to complex. Her work is the single strongest argument that the filter is behind us. She spent the last decades of her life at the University of Massachusetts Amherst, and her later career was marked by a fierce independence that sometimes crossed the line into contrarianism. She expressed skepticism about aspects of neo-Darwinism that most biologists considered settled, and she endorsed some ideas that the mainstream rejected. None of this diminishes endosymbiosis. The theory is as solid as anything in biology, but Margulis herself was a reminder that the people who make important discoveries are not always easy to categorize as right or wrong. They're often right about the big thing and wrong about smaller things, and history sorts it out eventually. She died on November 22nd, 2011, at age 73, from a hemorrhagic stroke. Sagan spent those same decades searching for the civilizations that might have made it through. He was the youngest scientist at Drake's Green Bank Conference in 1961. He co-designed the Pioneer plaques and the Voyager Golden Record, messages hurled into the void on the assumption that someone out there might find them. He was the most prominent public advocate for SETI in the 20th century. His 13-part television series Cosmos, which aired in 1980, was watched by over 500 million people in 60 countries. It remains the most widely viewed PBS series in American history. Sagan had a gift for making people feel the scale of the universe without being crushed by it, and he co-authored the T-TAP study in December 1983, the research that established the concept of nuclear winter, the idea that a full-scale nuclear war could produce enough soot and smoke to block sunlight for months, dropping global temperatures by tens of degrees and devastating agriculture worldwide. The acronym T-TAPS came from the initials of the 5 authors, Turco, Toon, Ackerman, Pollock, and Sagan. Think about the timing. December 1983, 1 month after Able Archer, 2 months after Petrov's incident, Sagan was modeling the mechanism by which civilizations might destroy themselves at the exact moment his own civilization was coming closest to doing exactly that. And the T-TAP study pitted Sagan directly against Edward Teller, the father of the hydrogen bomb, who disputed the nuclear winter findings and accused Sagan of politicizing science. Teller had been at that 1950 lunch table. He was one of the 4 men who heard Fermi ask where everybody was. 33 years later, he was arguing with Fermi's intellectual heir about whether the answer to that question might be nuclear self-destruction. Sagan died on December 20th, 1996, of complications from myelodysplastic syndrome, a blood disorder. He was 62. Hanson's great filter paper had been published just months earlier, in August 1996. There is no evidence Sagan ever read it, but his entire career, from the Green Bank Conference to the Pioneer Plaques to the nuclear winter research to Cosmos, was an extended meditation on the same question Hanson formalized. Are we alone? And if not, why is it so quiet? Frank Drake outlived most of his contemporaries. He died on September 2nd, 2202, at his home in Aptos, California, at the age of 92. His equation, the one he scribbled on a blackboard to give a small conference an agenda, became one of the most famous formulas in science. Colleagues described him as soft-spoken and intellectually brave. He championed SETI when it carried what scientists called a giggle factor, when serious researchers risked their careers by admitting they thought searching for alien signals was worthwhile. In his personal life, he raised orchids, made jewelry, and volunteered for 10 years on a county suicide hotline. His daughter Nadia Drake wrote after his death that above all, she celebrated his humanity, his tenderness, his gentle spirit, a man who spent his professional life listening for signals from other worlds, spent a decade of evenings listening to people in crisis on the phone. Nick Bostrom, who connected the great filter to existential risk more rigorously than anyone, was born in 1973 in Helsingborg, Sweden. He founded the Future of Humanity Institute at Oxford in 2005, and it became the intellectual center of gravity for existential risk research. In its 2 decades of operation, FHI produced or influenced much of the foundational work on AI safety, the Great Filter, existential risk quantification, and the long-term future of civilization. It was closed on April 16, 2004. Bostrom called it death by bureaucracy. His colleague Anders Sandberg, co-author of the Dissolving the Fermi Paradox paper, described it as gradual suffocation by faculty bureaucracy. The world's leading research center on humanity's survival was shut down not by any of the threats it studied, but by academic politics. There is probably a lesson there about the kinds of dangers we are good at perceiving and the kinds we are not. Bostrom's own reputation was complicated by the surfacing in early 2002-03 of a 1996 email containing racist language which he apologized for, but which added controversy during an already turbulent period for the effective altruism movement following the FTX fraud scandal. The man who did stand-up comedy on the London circuit during graduate school, who once published a paper exploring whether we might be living in a computer simulation, now heads the MacroStrategy Research Initiative. His work on the Great Filter remains among the most cited in the field. So where does this leave us? I want to try to be honest about what we know and what we do not, because the temptation in a story like this is to pick a side, declare the filter behind us or ahead of us, and build a dramatic conclusion around that certainty. The evidence does not support that. What we know is that the eukaryotic transition is the strongest single candidate for a past great filter. It consumed nearly 2 billion years. It occurred exactly once Nick Lane's bioenergetic analysis provides a compelling mechanistic explanation for why it was so difficult. If this is the primary filter, we have cleared the hardest hurdle, and our cosmic solitude is the price of our improbability, not the prelude to our extinction. That is a defensible position, supported by real data. What we also know is that SETI's null results tell us far less than they appear to. The cosmic haystack analysis shows we have searched an almost negligibly small fraction of the relevant parameter space. Declaring the universe empty based on current SETI data is like scooping a cup of water from the Pacific Ocean, finding no fish in it, and concluding the ocean is lifeless. Every new telescope, every new frequency range, every new observation strategy narrows the uncertainty, but we remain profoundly ignorant about whether anyone is out there. What we also know is that the next century is shaping up to be extraordinarily dangerous, regardless of where the Great Filter lies. Ord's aggregate estimate of roughly 17% existential risk over 100 years is driven by threats that did not exist a few generations ago, and that will only intensify. Unaligned artificial intelligence at 10%, engineered pandemics at around 3%, nuclear war and climate change at lower but non-zero probabilities. A new concern emerged in December 2004 when scientists from 9 countries warned that the laboratory synthesis of mirror bacteria, organisms constructed from mirror image molecules that would be invisible to all natural immune systems and decomposers, could create self-replicating life forms against which Earth's biosphere has no defense. We keep inventing new ways to fail, and the nuclear record, those 4 incidents I described, demonstrate something that should terrify anyone thinking carefully about civilizational survival. We have already been saved by luck, not by policy, not by institutional safeguards, by a colleague calling in sick, by a submarine officer's individual refusal, by a spy who happened to be in the right place, by a rocket that happened to fly the right direction. We built systems that nearly destroyed us and were rescued by contingencies so fragile they border on absurd. The question is not whether our safety systems are good enough. The question is whether any technological civilization's safety systems can ever be good enough, given the speed at which destructive capabilities outpace institutional wisdom. Nothing in the evidence rules out the possibility that the Great Filter has multiple components, some behind us and some ahead. Bostrom himself noted this. Perhaps the eukaryotic transition eliminated 90 to 9.9% of all potential civilizations, and perhaps technological self-destruction eliminates 90% of the survivors. Both filters operating together would produce a galaxy far emptier than either would alone. The steps behind us could have been genuinely hard, and the steps ahead of us could be genuinely lethal. These are not mutually exclusive. So what does the silence tell us? It tells us that somewhere in the journey from chemistry to cosmos, there is a wall, maybe more than one. The evidence suggests we have probably, though not certainly, already climbed the highest part of it. The 2 billion year slog from prokaryote to eukaryote, the 4.5 billion year path from sterile rock to a species that can wonder why the sky is quiet. That biology was almost unimaginably hard, and we should not be casual about the fact that we are here at all. But the evidence also suggests we are now standing on a narrow ledge, looking down at a series of crevasses that may have swallowed everyone who came before us, or that nobody before us has ever reached this ledge, or that nobody before us has ever existed at all. Each of these possibilities has profoundly different implications for what we should do next, but remarkably, they all point in the same direction. Protect what exists. Build wisely. Understand that the window may be narrow and that nothing about our survival to this point guarantees our survival past it. The uncertainty is the point. We do not know. And in the absence of knowledge, the only rational response is to treat the future filter as if it is real, because the cost of being wrong is not the loss of an argument, it is the loss of everything. Enrico Fermi died in 1954. He never saw his lunch table question become one of the most famous problems in science. Frank Drake died in 2022, having spent 62 years listening for an answer that never came. Carl Sagan died in 1996. The same year, Robin Hanson put a name to the thing that might explain the silence. Lynn Margulis died in 2011, having proved that the most important step in the history of life on this planet was a freak accident that took 2 billion years to happen. Stanislav Petrov died in 2017, having saved civilization by disobeying a computer, and nobody noticed for months. Each of these people, in their own way, worked on a piece of the same problem. Why are we here? Why is nobody else? And what does the answer mean for how long we have left? There is a version of this story that is almost unbearably hopeful. In that version, the great filter was the eukaryotic transition, 2 billion years of prokaryotic stasis, and then one freak accident, one bacterium swallowed by one archaeon in one place at one time, and everything changed. Every redwood and every hummingbird and every human who has ever written a poem or built a telescope descends from that single event. If that is the filter, we are the winners of the most improbable lottery in the history of the universe. The silence of the cosmos is the sound of our own extraordinary rarity, and the road ahead is open. Not easy, not guaranteed, but open. There is another version that is harder to sit with. In that version, the biological steps were difficult but not uniquely so. Life is scattered across the galaxy. Some fraction of it becomes complex. Some smaller fraction develops intelligence. And then, at roughly our stage of technological development, they build the tools that can destroy them, and they fail to develop the institutions and the wisdom and the foresight to survive what they have built. Not every time, perhaps not even most times, but often enough that the galaxy, 13 billion years old and hundreds of billions of stars wide, remains quiet. In this version, we are not winners of a cosmic lottery. We are contestants in a test we have not yet passed, a test with a very high failure rate, and the proctor is indifferent. There is also a version in which both stories are true simultaneously. The biology was almost impossibly hard, and the technological gauntlet is almost impossibly dangerous. Maybe only 1 in a trillion planets ever produces a eukaryotic cell, and of those vanishingly few that do, maybe only 1 in 100 makes it past the nuclear age and the AI age and whatever else is waiting. Both filters together would produce a universe so empty that not a single other civilization exists within our entire observable volume. Not because of one barrier, because of 2, compounding, each one sufficient to produce silence on its own, and together producing a silence so deep it seems like a law of nature. The galaxy is 13 billion years old. It contains somewhere between 100 billion and 400 billion stars. Trillions of planets orbit them. The chemistry of life is everywhere. The conditions for planets are common, and as far as we can tell, the universe is completely, profoundly, and perhaps permanently silent. That silence is either the greatest gift we have ever received or the most ominous warning we have ever been given. We do not yet know which, but the people who figure it out, if anyone ever does, will be answering the question that Enrico Fermi asked over lunch 76 years ago in a log cabin in the New Mexico desert. Where is everybody? And the answer, whatever it turns out to be, will tell us exactly how much time we have left to get it right.